minority group from Myanmar, and this is where the controversy has always been, sadly. They trace their heritage, ancestry back over hundreds and hundreds of years in that region, and claim to be one of the first Muslim groups in this region, with their history of coming across the various traders who've come to South Asia over many years. So they are an interesting, very interesting group. They mainly reside in Rakhine State in Myanmar, which borders along Bangladesh. The Myanmar government, however, have always said that they are not indigenous to that state and were in fact imported from the Chittagong, Cox's Bazar area of Bangladesh by the British during colonial times to work in that area. And their position has always been they are not Rohingya. They refuse to even acknowledge that word. They instead call them Bengali and will insist that they must return to Bangladesh. Of course, the Bangladeshi government has said that's nonsense. And this is where we've seen a lot of the persecution and the issues arise. So one of the key things that happened really was with independence, when Burma became independent following the Second World War. Their constitution recognised a number of the minority groups. The Burma majority, which are Buddhist, make up about 70% of the population of Myanmar. But then there are a number of ethnic groups, mainly sort of from the east bordering Thailand, around the north, and then obviously the west as well. So you have groups like the Karen, the Karenni, the Chin, who are Christian groups, but there are a number of other groups. And while they are recognised in the constitution, they have still had issues with the Burmese military, who, as we know, not long after independence, we've had a number of military coups. In fact, we've had a military government operating there for many years. And slowly but surely, even though the Rohingya weren't initially recognised, they did have citizenship rights. And they were able to vote in a lot of the early elections, as long as you proved that you'd been living there prior to the Second World War, you were able to get citizenship. The Burmese government has systematically taken that away from the Rohingya, slowly but surely made sure that the Rohingya have become stateless in their own country and in their own homes. I guess one of the first, there have been a number of different expulsions of the Rohingya. The first one was in 1978 when there was a military crackdown. This led in 1982 to probably the most draconian redrafting of Myanmar's citizenship laws. And it was at that point in time that they really did become stateless in their own country. They lost pretty much all their rights. They were considered foreigners and had a number of restrictions placed upon them. So if they wanted to even move from village to trade, they had to get permission. If they wanted to marry, they had to get permission. The screws were increasingly put onto this group to make their life absolutely miserable. And the rhetoric also was ramped up that these people were foreigners and would have to go back to Bangladesh. So we've probably seen 5 or 6 major crackdowns on the Rohingya since 1978. Probably the biggest one up until recently was 91, 92, when we saw hundreds of thousands of people forced across the river into Bangladesh. It's a fascinating place to go to and you realise in many respects how arbitrary borders are. You know, those people in the Cox's Bazar area, Rakhine State, have been travelling back and forth that river for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, you know, they are ethnically similar, which is in part why the Myanmar government thinks that they aren't really Burmese at all. But, you know, you do realise just how similar the people are. But in 91, 92, we saw that first major movement of people. The Bangladeshis kept them in camps. It was pretty brutal. They realised that the only way to get them back was to brutalise them to go back, as well as diplomatic efforts at the same time. When I first went to Cox's Bazar, to the refugee camps in 2007, there were still about 30,000 refugees who had been there since 1992 at that stage, and they were the ones that had refused to go back. But the Bangladeshi government, and this is still the case today, refuses to let any country resettle those refugees on the basis that would be a pull factor. Bangladesh is totally fearful of pull factors, which is somewhat ironic given the extraordinary push factors that you're actually seeing in Myanmar and by the Myanmarese government there. So we have seen a number of other major crackdowns, 2012, 2016, and then obviously 2017, August 2017 was when the military really decided to force the Rohingya out. And by this stage, the Rohingya were getting a lot more publicity than they had before, because we had seen a number of issues around boats and people getting on boats, and I'm happy to talk to some of those issues. And a lot of, I guess, signals to the government there that nobody really cared about the Rohingya and what was going to happen to them. And I think when governments who want to do diabolical human rights violations get that signal from their neighbours, then there's really nothing holding them back. And that's when we saw villages raided, burnt to the ground, systematic rapes, murders. You know, it's unclear how many people were actually killed in 2017, but essentially we know that at least 700,000 people, probably more, fled across. I've got a question there: why are the Rohingya so hated in their own country? What is the situation for other minority groups? I think one of the reasons is probably because they're Muslim. I think that is one of the key issues. I think they do look different because they look so similar to people across the river in Cox's Bazar. And yeah, there's this, you know, it's one of the poorest states. Rakhine State is one of the poorest states in a very poor country. So the sort of ethnic tensions within that state are already quite toxic. But this idea that they're not really Burmese at all, that they are actually Bangladeshi and should go home, is sort of fueled by those other tensions. I think there are other minorities, as I've mentioned, have similar issues, and there have been similar conflict. And, you know, we have seen hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Karenni and others in Thailand. And that conflict is firing up again as we speak. But yeah, the Rohingya, I think, because of Islamophobia, are the ones that have really copped it, you know, and have done so for the last 60 odd years or more. And with the 2017 expulsion, what we also saw, and it was happening, I think, even from 2012, was the complete destruction of those villages, you know, where their homes, they were totally gone. either that land was given to other groups, or we've got pictures of military bases being built on top of former villages. And a lot of the Rohingya population were rounded up and put in IDP camps, internally displaced camps. So there are now a number of IDP camps in Rakhine State. We think at least 130,000 people. Prior to 2017, there were probably 1.4, 1.5 million Rohingya in Rakhine State. So that violence essentially cut the population in half. And we know at least 130,000 are in these internally displaced camps, which are absolutely horrific. Barbed wire fences surrounding them, their ability to come in and out is almost impossible. There are no medical services in the camps. They're all outside the camps. So to get medical treatment is extremely difficult. Horrible issues with gender-based violence, which we've also seen in the refugee camps. But these have all been exacerbated by COVID, and I'm happy to talk more about the situation that COVID has exacerbated both in Myanmar, but also in Bangladesh as well, because it's meant that there is no access for any humanitarian or other external agencies. And so we really don't know the full story of what's going on inside those camps. I mean, interestingly, in Myanmar, most of the property is owned by the government. So private property is not really a thing. So it's very easy for the government to take any land it likes and hand it over to its cronies or its supporters or whoever. So even though you have people that have farmed the land for generations, the government can just take it away. And that's why we've got this horrible situation of internally displaced people. I mean, education is another serious issue for the Rohingya, and their ability to be able to educate their children in Myanmar is pretty extraordinary. And when I went to Cox's Bazar in 2007, I would still say they are one of the most hideous refugee camps I've ever visited. Things have improved for a little bit, but then certainly have gone backwards more recently. And yet, when I went to Indonesia in 2015 to go and see where some of the Rohingya had been brought ashore, this was following the Andaman Sea crisis, where the boats had been stuck at sea for many, many months, and dozens of people died because governments refused to rescue them. And finally, it was the Achinese fishermen in Indonesia that rescued them. And just meeting the refugees in those camps, they were a mixture of refugees who had come from the Cox's Bazar camps and refugees who had fled directly from Rakhine State, Myanmar. And the ones from Cox's Bazar were so much healthier and so much better educated than the ones coming directly from Myanmar. I was totally shocked. I just couldn't believe that the situation in Myanmar would be that much worse than in Cox's Bazar. So it's probably worth talking about Bangladesh as well, because as I said, the refugee camps there sort of ballooned in a matter of weeks from 30,000 to over 700, probably closer to 800,000. We already knew that there were tens of thousands of Rohingya who had snuck into the country. And interestingly, after the sort of 92 expulsion, when those refugees were registered by UNHCR, even though UNHCR were operating in the camps, Bangladesh refused to let UNHCR register any more Rohingya. So all the Rohingya that have arrived in Bangladesh sort of post 92 were just considered illegal immigrants by the Bangladeshi government. And that sort of changed when you suddenly had over 500,000 people rock up into your country. But there were a significant number, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Rohingya already living in Bangladesh illegally prior to the mass exodus in 2017. So estimates were up to 1 million people in this tiny strip of land, sort of between the Teknaf River and the ocean in Cox's Bazar. And it's a pretty bleak place to begin with. I cannot imagine how they've accommodated an extra 1 million people on that land. It's still pretty frontier in many respects. You'll look at the causes of death each week, and there'll be a number of people who will be killed by wild elephants, because you still have wild elephants roaming that area, and suddenly there's 1 million people in their way. And so, yeah, people are getting trampled to death in, something you don't expect. But obviously there are monsoons. In the monsoon season, it regularly floods. And, that is pretty extraordinary to see. But when you look at the flimsy accommodation they've got, you realise just how likely it is that people are going to get killed during the monsoon season. Once again, Bangladesh very generous in allowing the people to come, but again said they're not going to be allowed to stay, and we're not going to put in a lot of these sort of permanent facilities that you would need, like sanitation, because those things would be a pull factor for others to come. So, they've kept those camps deliberately basic, and that has meant, obviously, issues around healthcare of again being quite acute, and it's also meant that people in those camps have once again looked at ways to get elsewhere, and so we have seen last year again more boats trying to leave, although governments are now cracking down on that following what happened in 2015. But again, even last year, the lessons of 2015 were completely forgotten, with countries like Thailand and Malaysia intercepting those boats and pushing them back out to sea, refusing to let them land. Or if they were forced to take them, like Malaysia, the people were detained and told that we were going to send you back. And a number of them were handed straight over, or a few months later, to the Burmese authorities without having access to UNHCR. So none of the neighbouring governments have been very sympathetic, sadly. Bangladesh has now set up its own island detention centre. We all know what that's like. They've built this camp on a little island off the coast called Bassam Shah. It's set up to take 100,000 people. I think there's about 10,000 at the moment. And this island didn't exist until around the 1970s. It was formed in the delta. It's mud and silt. So it is really not very stable at all. And so there are enormous concerns what could happen if there is a major cyclone or storm in that region to anybody who's on that island. So the UN has only recently been granted access to go and see, and the Australian government was actually one of the governments, a few governments were able to go and see as well. But we haven't had many reports back yet around what it's like. We were starting to get education at least set up in the camps in Cox's Bazar, but COVID again put a dampener on that. Nobody was allowed in, nobody was allowed out, so no work. Everyone's stuck in their homes. So again, of course, issues around domestic violence, gender-based violence have just skyrocketed again. And one of the ways that the Rohingya have learnt to protect their daughters is to marry them off. And so issues around very young girls being married off are quite prevalent, and that includes marrying them off to men who are considered richer because they're working as refugees in Malaysia. There's about 100,000 Rohingya in Malaysia. So when we saw these people who were rescued in 2015 in Indonesia, there were 15-year-old girls saying, well, I'm on my way to meet my husband in Malaysia. Can you get me to Malaysia so I can meet my husband? So, you know, my daughter was 15 at the time and I was just horrified. But for the families, the alternative is to keep them in these dreadful camps in Cox's Bazar with everything that's going on there. And that's, you know, marrying them off to somebody who at least working in construction or whatever in Malaysia is considered better.
So a few questions there, Graham, if you'd like to have a look. There's 3 or 4.
Yeah, I hear. There are not that many resources in Rakhine State. There are, I mean, it's the interesting thing about Myanmar is that, you know, there is some natural resources which are being exploited and want to be exploited by China and India, which is why both those major powers aren't doing a lot to criticize them. Rakhine State itself is very flat and very agricultural, and it's, you know, as I say, it's one of the poorer states in Myanmar. So these were mainly farmers, rice farmers, and that's what they've been for generations. Is there a plan for those in Cox's Bazar? Well, this is the big question, and remember, they've been there since August 2017. The plan, as far as Bangladesh is concerned, is that they're going to go back to Myanmar. That's the plan. The international community agrees and says, yes, the best thing is for everybody to go home. But the UN has made it very clear that that can only happen in safety and dignity. And one of the key things that everyone is calling for, including Amnesty, is that they get their citizenship rights restored. So when they go back, they have full rights as citizens. There is no point forcing them back to be stateless and stuck in IDP camps in Rakhine State at the whim of the Myanmar military. And the refugees themselves are refusing to go back. There have been a number of attempts to try and force them back, and they have point blank refused. They're saying, we're not going back while, you know, we have A, no rights, and B, the military are still going to kill us. So that's where the negotiations really are stuck, sadly. And in the meantime, the refugees are going nowhere, because once again, the Bangladeshi government is refusing to allow any resettlement, even of, you know, orphan children or women at risk or people with acute medical needs. They refuse to allow anyone to be resettled. When we went in 2007, we were able to put a bit of pressure, particularly on the Australian government, to take some of those Rohingya, and other governments like Canada and Ireland did as well. But that really only lasted until the next Bangladeshi election, and then the new Bangladeshi government said, no, we're stopping this, we think it's a pull factor. So there's actually a very successful Rohingya community up in Brisbane who, you know, we were able to get a few hundred out in the brief window we had, and they've done very, very well. And the Australian government has committed to take more from Bangladesh. But one of the problems is Australia won't take them from anywhere else. So I can come back to that. There is a question, is there any plan for, so does Australia have a responsibility in what happened in 2015? Only partly. I think a lot of people have responsibility for what happened in 2015. A lot of things happened in the build up to that. Primarily, a lot of corrupt officials from Thailand and Malaysia and elsewhere, Bangladesh and even in Myanmar, were making money smuggling the refugees to Malaysia. But then in doing that, you know, they would get to the Thai-Malaysia border. They would be held in camps, and the people smugglers holding them in the camps would then hold them for ransom again and force the families to pay more money. And if you couldn't pay more money, then they were beaten to death as an example to the others to force their families to pay more money. And so I think it was CNN. We were hearing a lot about this and a lot of denial, and CNN did an amazing expose and highlighted these death camps on the border. And so Thailand was forced to act and actually charge some of their own officials who were making money out of this smuggling operation. And when that happened, that shut that route to Malaysia. So that forced people on boats. That was seen as the other way to get to Malaysia. When it was clear that Thailand were forcing people back, that Malaysia were forcing people back out to sea, it was put to the Australian government and who headed the Bali process with Indonesia. Well, what can we do to help? Should we rescue these people? And that was, Tony Abbott's infamous moment where he said, nope, nope, nope. We're not going to protect people who try and get on boats. He just couldn't disconnect that all refugees getting on boats must be evil, through this lens that he viewed boat arrivals to Australia with zero understanding. And, coming into the 2013 election, the Conservatives actually came with a regional deterrence policy. Their idea was to stop any refugees even coming into this region. They didn't understand that 80 to 90% of the refugees in this region are essentially Burmese refugees. They're from this region. Only about 10% are Iraqi or Afghan or Sri Lankan. But in their mind, they are just totally paranoid. So this regional deterrence policy is still part of their platform. And so they refused to provide any help. And the Bali process was totally found wanting in rescuing those people. And so eventually, Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia had to come together and come up with their own solution. And then the Bali process kicked into gear and was trying to come up with mechanisms right up until the most recent Andaman Sea crisis, which again, they had all these great plans at their meeting at the beginning of 2020, but when the rubber hit the road with COVID, nobody was again willing to rescue those Rohingya who are on boats. COVID has not only impacted on those in the IDP camps in Myanmar, it's also impacted on those in the camps in Bangladesh, but in the region as well. Malaysia was starting to show far more sympathy for the Rohingya as their Muslim brothers, as there was a big Rohingya community in Malaysia. With COVID, xenophobia just went through the roof. And, it was foreigners that were bringing COVID into Malaysia. So it didn't matter that the Rohingya had been living there for years and years. It didn't matter that the Rohingya who were on the boats had left Cox's Bazar well before COVID had come anywhere near that region. Didn't matter. These were foreigners. They were bringing COVID. And so it was really toxic in Malaysia, what had happened, and not much better in Indonesia either. I know there are a few more questions. With rising tensions both on the Sino-Indian border and in the South China Seas, it could be reasonable to suggest the Rohingya would be extremely vulnerable to greater atrocities. What are some of the matters that are in place to counter this, and what could be done now? I think one of the key concerns for the Rohingya is the military coup that happened in February. There is a question there about Aung San Suu Kyi. Sadly, the major expulsion sort of happened before she was elected, and there was great hope that she would do something, particularly from the Rohingya, who have long supported her and supported her father. But she knew where her popular base was, and it certainly wasn't the Rohingya. So she pretty much turned a blind eye and sadly really betrayed the Rohingya while she was in power. And yeah, ultimately with the coup, the general who's now in charge, he was the general that orchestrated the 2017 attacks. So you can just imagine how fearful the Rohingya are now. And it's been really interesting that, you know, the Gulf states, I mean, a lot of Rohingya have gone off to work in the Gulf states. They've got fake Bangladeshi passports, etc., and are working, you know, in construction, etc. So when we saw a bit of a dip in the economy, every time there's a dip in the economy, all those people are kicked out. And that's why when that door shuts for the Rohingya, they have to move to places like Malaysia. Now, there's a lot of complex pieces at play for this group, unfortunately. Once again, it's been deathly silenced from the Gulf states around the persecution of the Rohingya, by and large. So, yeah, what can be done is a really big question, because I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, unless ASEAN or somebody else finally decides to step up. I'll just go to some of the other questions. Some are paying bribes to be, are the Rohingya in Bangladesh being vaccinated against COVID at all? The short answer is no, not yet. And certainly the Rohingya in Myanmar aren't being vaccinated as yet, but a large part of this, I think, is because there just aren't a lot of vaccines in those countries anyway. And there is a big push to make sure at least the ones in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh will get vaccinated. But because with COVID, a lot of the foreign groups have been forced to leave, like MSF and others, there are not a lot of health professionals there to roll it out. So, yeah. Bribes for being allowed to return. I mean, the bribes are happening all over the place. The reality is most Rohingya don't want to go back to Myanmar. Some, you know, historically have been able to pay bribes to get to the capital and other places and have fake documents. But if they're caught, they get sent to Rakhine State. You know, we've often had situations here in Australia where people have used fake documents, Rohingya have used fake documents to get to Australia and then sought asylum, and they've been rejected on the basis that their document means that they can live happily in the capital. And the reality is for them, no, they'll never officially be citizens. And if they ever get caught, which they ultimately will, they'll be forced back to Rakhine, and the situation is still absolutely dire. So, you know, that's why we will probably like to see, or likely see, more people being smuggled again. There are looking at smuggling happening again through Thailand. As I say, when one door shuts, another door seems to open somewhere. But it's only a matter of time before that door will shut too, and those people will be trapped again. And they're always, you know, horribly exploited and brutalized in that smuggling journey. It's really horrific. And then ultimately we'll need to see what happens to those 100 or so thousand in Malaysia as well. Australia, as I said, is one of the few countries that won't resettle Rohingya out of Malaysia. Most of the other, or I think all the other countries that resettle refugees out of Malaysia will settle Rohingya, but Australia won't, because again, they don't want to see people on the move. It's part of Australia's policy when it comes to resettlement. So we will, which is interesting, because we will resettle Chin out of Malaysia, we'll settle Karen out of Malaysia, pretty much any other group, predominantly Christian groups, but we won't resettle the Rohingya. And the Rohingya who are also stuck now in Indonesia are also having a really terrible time. And once again, Australia has essentially stopped any resettlement for people who've come to Indonesia post 2014. So any of the more recent arrivals of Rohingya can't be resettled under Australia's policy out of Indonesia, even if the policy was to resettle them. So yeah, it means that those groups are stuck, and often those Rohingya in Indonesia get themselves smuggled to Malaysia, because at least there's a bigger diaspora community in Malaysia, and there is work in the informal sector in Malaysia. You know, it's always the dangerous, dirty jobs, but for them, it's at least it's a job. So, you know, through all these coups, all these crackdowns, we've had Rohingya stuck on Manus and on Nauru and stuck in detention here in Australia. You know, one of the craziest groups of Rohingya we had in Australia was a group that came by boat post-July 2013 and were told that they would be sent offshore, which they were, but part of the agreement is that they weren't allowed to send people to Manus and Nauru if they had communicable diseases. And a lot of these Rohingya had hepatitis. And so those governments forced them to come back to Australia, and on the basis that they were going to get treatment for hepatitis in Australia. And they then spent a number of years in detention in Australia, not getting treated for hepatitis, until ultimately realising that they were never going to be able to send them back to PNG and Nauru. They released them on those final departure bridging visas. They were one of the first groups to get the final departure bridging visas, which get rolled over every 6 months. But for those Rohingya, they were happy. For the first time in their life, they actually had a document that gave them a legal status somewhere, you know, which just shows how appalling their life had been up until that point. I will have a look at some of the other questions. Is Labor in line with the coalition refugee policy and the Rohingya? I don't think so. It's an interesting one, and the Labor Party certainly were on board with resettling the Rohingya out of Bangladesh. They didn't take many Rohingya from other countries, but I think could probably be convinced. I think, yeah, the coalition policy of not resettling anybody from Indonesia post 2014, I think Labor would overturn that policy. But again, you know, I'm speculating on meetings I've had with Labor officials, what they would actually do when they get in power, you know, is another question. But I think, you know, Labor was actually, even though the Bali process was set up by John Howard, Labor was actually very committed to the Bali process. So I think, you know, in terms of re-engaging that and re-engaging Indonesia, I think they would look at ways to support Indonesia. We've got about 16,000 refugees stuck in Indonesia now from various different nationalities. I'd say the most would probably be Afghan, but there's a variety of different cohorts stuck in Indonesia. And yeah, I mean, certainly under COVID, but even before that, with Trump scaling back resettlement, very few people were being resettled out of Indonesia. So yeah, I think Labor would probably shift that policy and would actually start resettling more out of Indonesia. But how many Rohingya, we just don't know. I like your comment, Gail. I won't say anything. As Amnesty, of course, we're totally politically impartial. But yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, and you know, there are a number of different forums where we're trying to ensure that there is greater focus on the situation of the Rohingya. You know, in the last few years, we've had the Global Compact on refugees, which a number of countries in this region have signed up to, the Global Compact on migration, which more countries in this region have signed up to. Australia hasn't signed up to that one. We do have ASEAN, we do have the Bali process. So there are various mechanisms at play that should step in to be able to assist the Rohingya. But at the moment, they really are forgotten. At the beginning of this chat, I put in a report. It's actually from one of the human rights subcommittees in Canada, and Amnesty gave a number of evidence to that report. So it gives a fairly good summary of what's going on and some really clear recommendations from the Canadian government. And I think the Canadian government has probably been one of the leaders when it comes to try and improve the human rights situation for the Rohingya. Sadly, you know, Australia has not been so forthright in its comments. Australia has always tried to play a behind the scenes approach, diplomatic approach to the Myanmar government, you know, including doing work with the Myanmar military, which I think they have now suspended finally. Amnesty's been calling for that for years, but they have tried to have a dialogue with the government there. And we've said clearly that's not working. At some point in time, you have to be able to call out the atrocities that are happening and demand that human rights of the Rohingya are recognised. But yeah, until their citizenship is restored, I can't see a lot changing, sadly. It's all pretty bleak and horrible, and I think the coup has made the situation worse. We did have a lot of hope when Aung San Suu Kyi was elected. A lot of that was dashed, but it's certainly not as bleak as it is now. The level of COVID is, and this report highlights it, the reported cases are quite low, and that's the same in the camps. There have been cases, there have been deaths, but I think a big part of the problem is that they're just not testing. You know, and without the testing, we really don't know the full situation of how bad COVID is impacting, and also without the oversight as well, without any access to the Rakhine state more broadly, in those camps more specifically, we really have no idea what's going on. And I think with things flaring up in India, it's can only spread, you would think. I've seen you've put up the ALP national platform. Thanks for that, Brett. I think, you know, it has been one of the key things that Amnesty and a number of other groups have pushed for quite strongly in the lead up to the conference a month or so ago with the ALP, was to get a pretty clear commitment on doing something for the Rohingya, because, yeah, to date, the response from the Australian government has been pretty poor. I mean, we were one of the larger donors early on in 2017, and a fair bit of focus on issues around women and girls and education. But in terms of public support or public condemnation, we've been pretty poor. Any other questions on the Rohingya or Australia more broadly? That's, yeah, there's a comment there as well that, yeah, we did see further decreases in our foreign aid as well. Is there anything you can do to lobby the government? I think definitely yes. I think it is worth writing to our foreign minister and highlighting the ongoing situation facing the Rohingya. There's a number of reports like that one that's recently come out from Canada. And if you want to use that as the first instance to say, here are some recommendations the Canadian government is making around the situation facing the Rohingya. The report actually looks at both the situation for Venezuela and Rohingya. So an interesting read if you want to read what's happening in South America as well. But if you look at the recommendations there for the Rohingya, I would certainly recommend either individually or as your group writing to our minister and just saying, we need to be in step with Canada on these issues and we need to be doing more to support the Rohingya. I'll put the link again. I think I've still got it here, I know. So, yeah, if you want to have a look at that. Another great resource, the Kaldor Centre last year did a series of reports, Kaldor Centre at University of New South Wales, looking at the 5-year anniversary of the Andaman Sea crisis. And so there were a number of different writers looking at the ways forward, but also looking at what happened to the Rohingya, and a lot of good historical references as well too. But yeah, I would definitely recommend some of they're not very long papers, so they're a good read. But the Kaldor Centre has done some amazing work in this space, Madeline Gleeson, and I would certainly recommend having a look at that website and the reports that were done. Hopefully with COVID, if the situation does change, we'll be able to get back into Cox's Bazar, and we'll be able to get more organisations back in there to provide assistance. Hopefully we'll get education started for the kids, which would at least be something. But yeah, at the moment they are fenced in and it's very, very grim. But fingers crossed, we've turned a corner. If they don't get a second wave over there, and we can start to see some improvements.
I've put a couple of messages in the chat, Graham, just if you can briefly explain the final departure visa.
Okay. It's an important one because the government is now using it more and more. When they started to bring people back from Nauru and PNG for medical treatment, we'd had the Big Kids Off Nauru campaign and people were brought back. A lot of the families were put into community detention, but a lot of the men were kept in held detention. And just like happened under the Labor Party, they realised that they weren't going to be able to keep them locked up forever. As much as this government loves locking up refugees. So they needed a way to get them out into the community, and they needed a way to do it that didn't look like that they were backflipping on their commitment to never ever allowing these people to reside in Australia. So it's a bridging visa E. So essentially that's what it is. Anybody who was released previously under Labor were put on a bridging visa E. If you're seeking asylum in Australia, they put you on a bridging visa E while you go through the process, and it varies. Sometimes it has work rights, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have study rights, sometimes you don't. They can do what they like essentially with the bridging visa E. The final departure of bridging visa E, got this nasty name because the government didn't want to appear to be soft, so they called it something really awful and said that they've only got 6 months, knowing full well that they were going to roll it over like they do with every other bridging visa. And they have work rights and Medicare and nothing else, no other support. So, yeah, we saw that initial group put out, and then pretty much everybody else that was brought back was put into community detention. But last year, the minister decided that community detention was getting too expensive. There were too many families. And so we started to see families, particularly in New South Wales, because of COVID, they didn't release the families out of CD onto the final departure bridging visas. But yeah, in the middle of a global pandemic, they kicked them out of their houses and that they'd been living in for years, and said, no, you've got 2 weeks, you've got to go find your own home, you've got to find a job, and you get zero support. So they did that pretty much up until December. They then put a hold because I think things got nasty with COVID again. But then this year they've started to release the Medivac guys, because unlike the other groups that they've brought back for medical treatment, the Medivac guys were kept in the APODs rather than putting them out into CD, which is what we thought they'd do. They were detained, as we know, for over a year in these hotels. But instead of now releasing them into CD, they've just also put them out on these final departure bridging visas. And so the first group that were released at the beginning of this year are now having to reapply again. If you know people on the final departure bridging visas, please get legal advice to put in the form, because they have to reapply every 6 months. It doesn't automatically tick over. You know, it's another really painful administrative thing that they force on these guys. But it's a tricky form. So get legal advice if you know people who are going through it. And yeah, now we're just waiting for the next group, those who are still in the APODs, to be released. And there are still a few hundred who are in community detention. And so they're also at risk of also being turfed out of their homes and put on the final departure bridging visas. Now, it's always been one of these weird things. If you're in community detention, at least you have a home, you have a little bit of support, but you're not allowed to work. Whereas final departure bridging visas, you get zero support, but at least you can work. So, you know, if you're a young, fit male, female who can get a job, that's great. You can now support your family here back home. But if you're not, if you're a family with small kids and you've been totally traumatized by years being brutalized on Nauru, being told, sorry, even though you've got school-age kids, you have to go find a job, we're not supporting you anymore, it's pretty rough. Yeah. So there's a few campaigns out there now that are looking at the final departure bridging visa, because again, we've probably got about 1,000 people who are going to end up on these visas. There's about 500, 600 at the moment. And they're not going to go anywhere. Whenever the media asks the government, what's your plan? The government says, well, they can go home, they can go back to Nauru, or they can be resettled somewhere else, but they can't stay here. And as we know, the reality is they can't go home, they're refugees. They can't go back to PNG or Nauru because that's what caused them to be sick in the first place. And they can't be resettled because the US deal's about to run out. So their alternative is to stay here indefinitely on visas that they're going to have to renew every 6 months.
Just one final question, because I know we're running out of time. Do you see any hope that they'll ever accept the New Zealand offer?
It's a very good question, and that's what Amnesty's working on right now. We know that the Prime Minister, Morrison, is heading over to New Zealand at the end of this month. So Amnesty is going to make a big song and dance while he's over there and try and get a commitment. the language that we've heard in the last 12 months has certainly been softer than what we were hearing a few years ago. And we know that the US deal is about to finish. And, you know, at the end of last year, they said they would look at it when the US deal finishes. The US deal is pretty much done. So now is the time. You know, the reality is there's less than 240 people now on Nauru and PNG. And in the last budget, to look after those 240 people, does anybody know how much it's going to cost us this year? It's $800 million. $800 million for less than 240 people. It's extraordinary. It's like $3 million per person per year. It's crazy. And yet New Zealand's offered to take 150 refugees a year. So, so yes, we are keeping our fingers crossed on New Zealand, and we'll certainly be working very hard to convince our Prime Minister that it makes sense to let the people go. Yeah.
Right, well, thank you so much, Graham. That's really informative as usual, and you know, we might see you in 5 years, but let's hope not.
Let's hope not, unless it's socially, and then I'm always.
Oh yeah, we're always up for a party.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks Graham.
Thanks everyone, I really appreciate you having me here.
Thanks
guys. Bye.
Bye.